For decades, McDonald's has been part of California's daily rhythm: morning coffee on the way to work, a late lunch between shifts, kids in the back seat begging for fries. This isn't just another restaurant chain here. California is where McDonald's history lives. The company's oldest operating location still stands in Downey. Corporate headquarters once sat in the state. Thousands of workers still clock in every day behind those counters. That's why the recent closures landed differently. Not because McDonald's is leaving California, it isn't, but because some of its most visible, long-running locations are shutting their doors. Downtown Oakland, a mall anchor in San Francisco, neighborhood stores that survived recessions, pandemics, and changing food trends, and now suddenly they're gone. The official explanation says these are isolated business decisions, franchise owners reassessing profitability, lease negotiations falling apart, safety concerns, operating costs climbing, all technically true, but the timeline shows something else. These closures aren't random. They're clustered around the same period, the same economic shifts, the same policy changes, and that's where pressure starts to build. This isn't about politics, it's about math. McDonald's operates on a franchise model. Corporate collects fees and rent. Local owners pay wages, utilities, insurance, and property costs. They absorb the risk. When expenses rise, headquarters doesn't feel it first. Franchisees do. What looked like a stable business suddenly became fragile. One former shift manager in Oakland described it this way: business was steady, lines still formed during lunch rush, but behind the scenes, costs were stacking up, rent up, insurance up, payroll up. The store didn't collapse overnight, it narrowed, fewer hours, skeleton crews. Then the notice came: 30 days, pack up, goodbye. Workers protested outside the building. Some had been there for years. No severance, no relocation, just a schedule erased. The system didn't fail. It worked exactly as designed. Franchise owners can close stores when margins disappear. Corporate distances itself. Communities absorb the fallout. And then social media took over. Headlines started to morph. McDonald's leaving California. Fast food fleeing the state. Governor under pressure. The claims spread faster than the facts. Panic language travels well online, but follow the paperwork. McDonald's is still expanding nationwide. It's still licensing stores across California. There's no corporate retreat, just localized collapses under financial strain. So why does this matter politically? Because these closures happened right as major labor policy changes took effect. And suddenly every shuttered door becomes a symbol, not of one business decision, but of a broader system stress test. What happens when costs rise faster than revenue? Who absorbs the hit? And how many closures does it take before it stops looking isolated? This pressure doesn't land on executives first. It lands on workers, on communities, and eventually on state leadership, forced to answer for outcomes they didn't directly control. But that wasn't the real story yet, because to understand what's happening now, you have to trace exactly how these closures unfolded, one by one, city by city. The first warning signs didn't come from corporate press releases. They came from handwritten protest signs taped to windows. Downtown Oakland was first, a McDonald's that had operated for decades, serving office workers by day and late-night crowds after dark. Employees showed up for shifts and found a notice posted near the register. The location would close in 30 days. No relocation plan, no guarantees, just a countdown. One cashier said she had raised 2 kids on that paycheck. Another had transferred from a different store years earlier when that location shut down. Now it was happening again. Same chain, same outcome, different address. The official explanation cited business conditions, no details, no numbers, just a phrase that covers everything and explains nothing. And then it happened again. In San Francisco, inside the Stonestown Galleria Mall, a McDonald's that had been there for more than 30 years quietly locked its doors. Regular customers showed up out of habit and found dark windows. No announcement, no farewell sign, just empty counters where families used to sit. What looked like coincidence started to form a pattern. Within weeks, more reports surfaced: smaller cities, suburban corridors, franchise owners declining to renew leases, some citing rent, others security concerns, several pointing to rising labor costs without using the phrase directly. The timeline matters. These closures didn't happen scattered across years. They clustered within months, right as new operating costs kicked in, right as franchise owners had to recalculate every line of their budget. Payroll isn't abstract, it's weekly, it's immediate, and for fast food operations, labor is the biggest expense. One former assistant manager in the Bay Area described the moment the math stopped working. Corporate standards didn't change, same staffing requirements, same speed of service metrics, same cleaning protocols, but wages jumped overnight and revenue didn't. Customers didn't pay more for burgers. Sales volume didn't surge. The cost structure shifted, but demand stayed flat. That's where pressure builds. Franchise owners face a choice: raise prices and risk losing customers, cut staff and risk failing inspections, or close. What looked like a business decision became a forced decision, and then came the public reaction. Videos spread online, commentators declaring California unlivable, others blaming corporate greed, each side pushing its own narrative, few asking the boring questions about leases, margins, and fixed costs. The governor's office didn't issue a statement. There was nothing official to respond to, no statewide McDonald's shutdown, just local closures. But silence became its own story. Pressure isn't always about direct responsibility. Sometimes it's about perception. When a major brand shutters high-profile locations, voters notice, headlines get written, opposition groups seize the moment. The narrative hardens before the facts do. Meanwhile, workers scramble. Some find transfers, others don't. Health insurance tied to hours disappears. Parents rearrange childcare. A job that felt permanent turns temporary overnight. Another blow landed when a Los Angeles area franchise quietly reduced operating hours. No closure, just shorter days, fewer shifts. Employees were told business was adjusting. That's how contractions start. Not with a bang, with a schedule change. The official explanation still says isolated cases, and technically that's accurate. But patterns aren't about intent, they're about outcome. Closures concentrated in urban areas, higher rent, higher security costs, higher payroll, the same variables repeating, not because of politics, but because of spreadsheets. And that brings us to the policy mechanics underneath it all, the part rarely explained in headlines, the laws, the thresholds, the fine print, because the real pressure doesn't come from one closure, it comes from the system that made it predictable. This story doesn't start with McDonald's. It starts with a number, $20 an hour. That's the new minimum wage for fast food workers in California. Not a suggestion, not a guideline, a mandate. It applies to chains with more than 60 locations nationwide. McDonald's falls squarely inside that definition. The official explanation says this was about fairness, cost of living, workers struggling to survive. And those pressures are real. Rent in California didn't pause. Grocery prices didn't fall. Gas didn't get cheaper. But follow the paperwork. This wasn't a simple wage hike. It came with compliance rules, staffing requirements, penalties, reporting obligations. For franchise owners, it meant rewriting budgets overnight. Here's the part rarely discussed. McDonald's corporate does not pay those wages. Franchise owners do. They sign long-term contracts. They lock in rent, equipment leases, supply pricing. Those numbers don't adjust when labor costs spike. So when wages rise suddenly, there's no flexibility. You can't renegotiate your fryer lease. You can't shrink your building. The only adjustable line item is staff, and even that has limits. Corporate standards dictate how many workers must be on shift, how fast orders must move, how clean bathrooms must be. Fail an inspection and penalties follow. So owners are trapped between two immovable forces: regulatory labor costs on one side, corporate operating requirements on the other, margins vanish in the middle. One franchise owner in Northern California described it quietly: no interviews, no press, just a private admission. Profit margins were already thin, 3%, sometimes less. A single equipment failure could wipe out a month's earnings. Then payroll jumped. Not gradually, immediately. What looked like a win for workers became a liability for operators, not because wages are wrong, but because the system gave no transition runway, no tax relief, no phased implementation, no regional adjustment for rent differences. The system didn't fail. It worked exactly as designed. Large corporations absorbed the brand value. Local owners absorbed the cost shock. Some tried to compensate, raising prices, cutting hours, eliminating overnight shifts, reducing maintenance schedules. Customers noticed longer waits, closed dining rooms, fewer employees doing more work, and then it stopped. Owners ran out of options. This is where the governor enters the picture, not because he ordered closures, he didn't, but because policy has consequences, predictable ones, economic ones. This isn't about ideology, it's about incentives. If labor becomes more expensive than revenue can support, businesses close. That's not protest, that's arithmetic. The administration defended the policy, argued workers deserved higher pay, and they do, no one disputes that. But what happens when a worker's raise eliminates the job entirely? That's the tension nobody wants to address. One former crew member in San Jose put it bluntly: she earned more per hour, but she got fewer hours. Her weekly pay stayed the same. Her workload doubled. Another worker lost his job entirely when his location shut down. The raise never reached him. This is what economists call displacement. But for families, it's rent money gone. Follow the money. Corporate profits remain stable. Franchise owners lose locations. Workers lose stability. Communities lose services. The governor is now under pressure, not because of one decision, but because the ripple effects are visible. Closed doors, protest signs, viral headlines. Policy doesn't exist in isolation. It interacts with markets, with contracts, with real people. And that brings us to the part nobody likes to discuss. Are these closures actually about wages, or are wages just the tipping point for deeper structural problems? Because when you look closer, something else appears: declining foot traffic, rising commercial rents, security costs in urban centers, insurance premiums. Labor was the match, but the room was already full of gasoline. Publicly, most franchise owners keep their statements short. Business conditions, operational challenges, long-term sustainability, carefully worded, legally safe, emotionally empty. But privately, the conversations sound different. One longtime operator in Southern California described his store as barely breathing even before the wage change. Foot traffic had been slipping for years. Delivery apps cut into margins. Mall locations lost anchor tenants. Parking lots emptied after dark. Revenue didn't collapse. It eroded. Then costs rose, not because of politics, but because of contracts. Commercial leases don't care about minimum wage laws. Insurance providers don't adjust premiums out of sympathy. Utility companies don't negotiate based on public policy. Those bills show up every month. Payroll used to be manageable, predictable. Now it dominates the budget. Some owners report labor costs exceeding 35% of revenue. In fast food, anything above 25% starts triggering alarms. And at that level, one slow week can sink the operation. What looked like a stable business became a high wire act. And then the data started confirming what owners already felt. Industry reports show job reductions across California's fast food sector, not mass layoffs, quiet ones, shorter shifts, fewer open positions, delayed hiring. On paper, employment numbers don't crash, they bend, but behind those curves are people losing 10 hours a week, 15, sometimes their entire schedule. One single mother in Riverside described it plainly. She earned more per hour, but she lost 2 shifts per week. Her paycheck shrank, her rent didn't. That's the gap between policy and practice. The official explanation says higher wages mean higher spending power, more money in local economies, but that only works if hours stay the same. They didn't. Follow the money again. McDonald's corporate still collects franchise fees, percentage-based. They rise when prices rise. Their exposure is limited. The brand is insulated. Franchise owners carry the volatility. Workers carry the uncertainty. This isn't about villainy. It's about structure. The franchise system pushes risk downward, always has. That's why it scales. What looked like entrepreneurship turned into liability. Some owners tried to sell their locations. Buyers disappeared. Why purchase a business with shrinking margins and rising fixed costs? So they closed, not in protest, not as a political statement, but as a financial surrender. And here's the part few admit publicly. Urban locations suffer the most. Higher rent, higher theft, higher security costs, higher insurance. The Oakland closure wasn't unique. It was typical. The store sat in a high-cost district. Night staffing required security. Insurance premiums surged after nearby incidents. Add higher wages, and the balance sheet collapses. Rural stores survived. Suburban drive-thrus stayed open. The pattern isn't ideological. It's geographic. The governor now faces pressure because these closures are concentrated where voters notice. Downtowns, malls, transit corridors. These are symbolic spaces. Their emptiness feels political even when it isn't. What's rarely mentioned is that McDonald's isn't alone. Other fast food chains are shrinking footprints, delaying expansion, testing automation, self-order kiosks, mobile-only pickup, not because they hate workers, but because machines don't require health insurance. The system adapts, slowly, quietly. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Did policy accelerate automation? Not intentionally, but incentives matter. When labor costs rise faster than technology costs fall, the equation changes. The system didn't fail, it optimized. And optimization doesn't care about human outcomes. That's the shadow side of efficiency, which brings us to the people left behind. Not executives, not policymakers, but workers. When a McDonald's closes, the building goes dark, but the impact doesn't. For workers, it starts immediately. Schedules vanish from apps. Health insurance tied to hours disappears. Some get transfer offers, others don't. Many are told to reapply at different locations as if their years of service reset to 0. One crew member in Oakland had worked the breakfast shift for 11 years. Same time, same routine. She knew the regulars by name. When the store closed, she applied at another location across town. They offered her part-time hours at a lower schedule priority. She lost her seniority overnight. Another worker in San Francisco had just signed a lease. The mall closure came 2 weeks later. No severance, no warning. His first missed rent payment arrived a month after his last paycheck. These aren't statistics. They're lives interrupted by spreadsheets. And this isn't about politics, it's about incentives. The policy goal was to help workers earn more. That part makes sense. But systems don't respond to intentions, they respond to numbers. When costs rise, businesses adjust. When margins disappear, locations close. When doors shut, jobs vanish. That chain reaction isn't ideological, it's mechanical. The governor now faces pressure not because of one law, but because of outcomes that can't be ignored. Closed storefronts, worker protests, viral videos, headlines that simplify what is actually a complicated system failure. The official explanation still says isolated cases, and on paper that's true. But for families who lost income, isolation doesn't matter. What matters is survival. This is where accountability becomes uncomfortable, not because anyone wanted this result, but because nobody planned for it. There was no safety net for displaced workers, no transition fund, no retraining program tied specifically to fast food closures, no support system beyond unemployment paperwork. Follow the paperwork. It's thin. The system didn't fail. It worked exactly as designed. Policies passed, businesses adapted, people absorbed the shock. And now the state faces a question it hasn't answered yet. How do you raise wages without eliminating jobs? How do you protect workers without pushing owners out? How do you balance fairness with sustainability? Those aren't political questions, they're mathematical ones. Because every decision changes the equation. If costs rise faster than revenue, closures continue. If automation becomes cheaper than labor, machines replace people. If urban rents stay high, downtown stores disappear. These aren't predictions. They're trends already visible. What looked like a win became a warning. And the pressure on state leadership isn't coming from corporations. It's coming from communities watching their neighborhoods hollow out. Empty storefronts send a message. So do protest signs. So do paychecks that suddenly stop. So here's the question. Who is responsible for the unintended consequences? Is it the policymakers who passed the law, the corporations who structured the franchise system, the market forces nobody fully controls, or all of them? Because accountability isn't about blame, it's about ownership. If this system produces winners and casualties, someone has to answer for both. And going forward, the choices get harder. Do lawmakers adjust policy to protect jobs? Do corporations absorb more risk? Do franchise models change? Do workers face more automation? These decisions are already being made quietly in boardrooms, in spreadsheets, in contract negotiations most people never see. The future of fast food in California isn't being decided by headlines. It's being decided by math. And the next closures won't come with press conferences. They'll come with dark windows. That's the real story. Welcome to the consequences phase. And the question remains, when the system produces damage, who steps up to fix it? Because the next move will define what kind of economy California builds next and who gets left behind.